Welcome back to the story on Valadco. This is a follow-up to Valadco Part 1. This is Valadco Part 2. Okay, like most businesses, Valadco had to get finances. And financing is usually a combination of equity capital and debt capital. As I mentioned earlier in Valadco Part 1, the capital customers that invested in Valadco had to meet the test of the 5 C's of credit. And the same thing is true for Valadco as an entity itself. So the corn growers themselves were the ones who invested the equity capital into Valadco, and then they sought debt capital from the St. Paul Bank for Cooperatives. Valadco was a cooperative, so it was qualified to borrow money from the St. Paul Bank for Cooperatives. Okay. One requirement that the St. Paul Bank for Cooperatives had was that the cooperative maintain a 40% net worth to total asset ratio. Of course, net worth is assets minus liabilities to get to the net worth. So as your typical accounting function. Now, so one of the things you have to have in any company is sort of management controls. So how do you do your accounting system? So at the beginning, Valadco used QuickBooks, which is a very common, relatively cheap accounting system. But we needed a more sophisticated system so we could track more items of expense and revenue so that we could fine-tune our efforts a little bit better. So we went from a very simple chart of accounts to a more detailed one. And as we grew, as I said before, we split my duties from president and chief financial officer to my being simply the president and us hiring a chief financial officer. So one of the things you need to do is you need to have an efficient production system. And what we were doing, we were hiring many new employees that really didn't know how to operate our production system. So we had to have an extensive production training program because we wanted our production to be done by a very, very specific way in a very detailed fashion. So we produced a production methods manual and a checklist of tasks that the barn employees were coached to learn. So, you know, they would be trained on one item, then when they show they're proficient in that was checked off. Then they would be taught another task, and when that was learned, it was checked off. Thank goodness we didn't have to develop this production training manual from scratch. We were able to build upon a manual provided by DeKalb. So now, whenever you train an employee in a new task, and some people don't like the term training because that's kind of like training animals, but you coach an employee, so the favorite term is coaching, but you use a method called tell, show, do, and receive feedback. That is, first you tell the employee what you want to happen. Then you show the employee how to do it. You ask if there are any questions. You ask the employee to attempt to perform the task. And then you give support for the effort. Tell the employee what he or she could do better. Tell him what needs to be done rather than the employee what not to do is more effective. And then demonstrate the procedure again if that's not seemed appropriate, and ask the employee to attempt the task again. And repeat the feedback, etc., attempts until the task is learned. This tell, show, do, feedback has proven to be a very effective coaching method to teach an employee a new task. Now, when I showed the organization chart earlier, I had up on the upper left-hand corner a list of outside experts that I didn't talk about at that point. Now, most companies need to rely on some outside experts. So sometimes you could hire all the expertise to have in-house, but oftentimes that means having an employee that's very low, poorly utilized. So instead of hiring a full-time person, you just hire the pieces of somebody's time that you need. And we did that at Valadco. So some of our outside experts, in addition to having our own chief operating officer who was a former DeKalb employee, we had a DeKalb representative would come to our farms, usually about once a month. We also had a nutrition veterinarian to advise us on the proper rations for our different levels of production and how much to be feeding each animal and so forth. We also had a regular veterinarian who monitored our herd's health status. We also contract with another person to enter the PigChamp data and prepare the reports. PigChamp was a computer program, actually quite cheap one, developed by University of Minnesota, and we were able to record a whole lot of information about when our sows were bred, how many, when they were bred, when they actually delivered, how many pigs they delivered, how long they were in the farrowing barns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we could fine tune our production methods. And instead of having our own buses or trucks to deliver animals to our finishing barns, we would hire truckers to transport our animals to market. Also, we would have our lagoons pumped out by contract manure handlers. So, however, I mentioned we had this PigChamp program. We've gathered a lot of the information, and we began to get production data. And we began to look at how our actual production records matched our financial projections. And we began to see there was some variance between what we had projected and what we actually were achieving. That was worrisome. And so we did the best we could of analyzing that information ourselves. But then we also began to have what we call production audits to conduct and fine-tune our performance. Our production audit, we would bring in an even different expert veterinarian who was expert in pig production, and we would have him come meet with us, our regular veterinarian, our nutrition veterinarian, our chief operating officer, our barn managers, and myself. And we would look over our production data and try to diagnose where the problems were and what we should do about them. So now, let's talk a little bit about leadership and how you operate in a company. There's various styles of leadership, and this Tenenbaum and Schmidt's leadership continuum discusses some of them. Now, it's really a question of how much authority is used by the manager and how much freedom is given to subordinates. And it really goes on a continuum because on one end, you can go very much of the boss-centered leadership, or you go on the other end with a lot of freedom to subordinates, and you have a subordinate-centered leadership. So when you can start here on the one end of the boss-centered leadership, where you really the boss is using the cell technique. The manager makes a decision and announces it. Or you can go a little bit more authority to the given up by the manager, more to the subordinates. The manager still makes a decision, but has to sell the decision to the employees. Giving up even more authority, the manager presents ideas and invites questions. Or you can go even further. The manager presents tentative decisions subject to change. Says, okay, here's what I tentatively think. What do you think about it? The employees give some feedback. Even getting more feedback is the manager doesn't make a tentative decision, but goes to the employees and here's a problem. Here are some options. What do you think about it? What are the pros and cons of these options? And collectively make a decision. Or even giving up even more authority, the manager simply says, here's the problem, you guys, here's within the limits of what you can and can't do, here are your constraints, but figure it out. And really, to the far right end, the manager permits subordinates to function within limits defined by the superior. So you go from tell, sell, consult to really share. So I give this continuum here, this theory, because I wanted to show in our production audits, we really were trying to go to the provide more and more freedom to subordinates. We wanted to involve them more in the decision-making process of what we were doing. And the reason we wanted to do that is it's been clearly shown that to the extent that employees are involved in the decisions, they have more buy-in to that decision, and they're more likely to implement that decision effectively. So we wanted our barn employees, at least our managers, really involved in these decisions that we were making, because some of these were very serious production decisions we needed to make. So again, let's look at how do you go about making decisions effectively. Really, the first step is really identifying a problem, defining it. Sometimes you look at a symptom and think that's the problem. So you really need to go down, dig deeper, and find out really what the underlying cause of the problem is. And that's where it becomes very handy to use that 5 whys approach that we talked about earlier. So next you go into the diagnosis and analysis of those causes. Try to find out just which causes are most important, which are most impactful. And that's where you want to direct your attention. You need to develop the alternatives and really develop the pros and cons of those alternatives. What are the, one of the alternatives obviously always is the no action alternative, which means a continuation of the problem. But sometimes that's the best option you've got. After evaluation of those alternatives, then you need to select which alternative you want to go with. Then you implement that chosen alternative, and then you do an evaluation and feedback, and you really start the cycle again, perhaps. If the problem is not solved, you have to go start a whole process all over again. Now, for example, just looking at where the causes of the problems were, if you ended up with a big problem of the number of pigs weaned per sow per year, you need to look at many different things. You need to look at the average parity of the sows. In other words, how many litters has the sow gotten? Because the reproductive capacity rises for first 2 or 3 litters, and then it begins to drop off quickly. So if you have a herd with a lot of very mature sows, you can't really expect to be that highly productive. We need to look at when is the average date? How many days after weaning are the sows bred? And because that will obviously affect not only the number of litters per year, but it also affects the average pigs born per litter. So you have to look at how many services did it take to actually get the sow bred. So it's really, sometimes it's one servicing, sometimes 2 or 3, depending on whether you've actually hit the sow at when she's mostly in heat. So you have to look at the very, very fine detail, and that's why the pig champ records are really important. So you can analyze all this kinds of stuff. Where was really the cause of the problem? And as I said, you use this 5 whys example. You go through the process of why, and you get down to the root cause. So now we've talked about this before, but it's worthy of talking about this again. Each person's perception is based on his or her prior experiences. And since we have all different experiences and different perspectives, it's helpful to get a group involved in diagnosing a problem and devising solutions. The group needs to have a wide range of experience and expertise. And that's what we were trying to pull together in our production audits. In this manner, we were likely to generate more ideas and less likely to just develop groupthink. We're all thinking the same thing. So Uh, as I mentioned before, we need to go up the ladder of inference. We need to be thinking about, what are the assumptions we make? How do we select among the data to be looking at? How do we add meanings? And each of us do this differently. So we really need to really dialogue with our employees to really kind of figure out what really was the problem, what really makes the most sense. So now, I'm a firm believer that goals are important. And not only goals, but really what we call stretch goals. Stretch goals are ones that cannot easily be achieved, but nonetheless is perceived reasonable to achieve. Employees are going to have to work a little harder than just every day. I'm just kind of come to work and punch in 8 o'clock and go home at 5. So need to be really engaged in the process. So. Also, I firmly believe the concept that goals that are not written down are just wishes. Until you write it down, it's just it's a good idea, but I'm not really committed to it. So now there's a whole concept of SMART goals. So what's a good goal? It should be the acronym SMART for specific and clear. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? Is it measurable? How do we know whether you've done it or not? Is it achievable? Is it really feasible? Do we have control of the factors that really affect the result? Is it relevant and recorded? Is this relevant right now? Obviously, you don't want to have a goal that it's sort of nice to achieve, but really doesn't make much difference. So you got to have it written down, and it's got to be relevant. And it needs to be time bound. You need to achieve a certain goal by a certain date. Otherwise, it's just, oh, well, I'd like to achieve it someday, but not a big deal when we do it this month or next. So one of the key ideas regarding SMART goals is that which is measured is what gets done. That's why SMART goals need to be measurable. I listened to a audio tape one time. Really, they were talking, the presenter was talking about sports and business. And he says, why are sports so interesting? Well, you've got a scoreboard. People are always watching. What's the score? Is one team ahead of the other, or whatever? Or if it's an individual sport like a runner, you have specific times that people are trying to beat. Well, if you don't have something measurable in a business and you're not keeping score, it's just not that interesting. It's not that engaging. It's not that motivating. So some businesses that are production businesses, they have video monitors that say how many units they've produced today or whatnot. We wanted to do very much the same thing at Valadco by keeping track of what our production data was, results were, and then letting the employees know really what are we doing, how are they doing. So if the employee has attained the goal previously set, well, great, but what if he or she hasn't achieved that goal? Well, there is a theory called the growth model, where if an employee makes a mistake or doesn't achieve a goal, the appropriate questions are really, well, what did you learn in this attempt? What might you do different next time? In other words, can they grow in their abilities and understanding of what they're trying to do? So when you compare the couple different kinds of mindset, I mentioned the growth mindset, where failure is an opportunity to grow. You have to say things like, I can learn to do anything I want. Challenges help me grow. My effort and attitude determine my abilities. Feedback is constructive. I'm inspired by the success of others. I like to try new things. Well, some people, on the other hand, have a fixed mindset, like they have blinders on. Failure is the limit of my abilities. I can't do any better. I'm either good at it or I'm not. My abilities are unchanging. I can either do it or I can't. I don't like being challenged. My potential is predetermined. When I'm frustrated, I give up. Feedback and criticism are personal. I stick to what I know. So hopefully you would have a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. You're much more likely to increase your abilities and grow in your abilities over time. The consequences of the growth mindset are really significant. You find inspiration in the success of others. You embrace challenges and risks. You learn from criticism and mistakes. Extend effort as it is extend effort as it is the path to mastery. You're persist in the face of setback. Failure is not a stopping point, but a place from which to grow and learn. So the result, you have increased self-confidence, you achieve more, and ready to grow. Growth mindset is extremely important, and I hope you develop and grow your own growth mindset. This may sound crazy, but you really want to build the employee's confidence to be wrong. You don't want the employee to be wrong, but you want the employee to be willing to be wrong, because you want them to seek the right result and be less interested in just being right. So now I'm a big fan of Tom Peters, who is an author of many management books, including books like In Search of Excellence, Lessons from America's Best Run Companies. He had a belief that we should fail forward. And I've heard it said that we could have made more progress if we had failed faster, with the idea that with each failure, if with a growth mindset, you look at, what did you do? What could you do differently? What did we learn? So Tom Peters was a very strong proponent of trying things, experimenting, building prototypes, what he called chunking it, do a piece of the big idea, and keep learning as you go. So I'm a big believer of this. I'm a strong proponent of the growth mindset. Here's some sayings that go along with that idea. Fail forward fast, fail faster, succeed sooner, move fast, break things, no matter. Try again, fail better. Experiment fearlessly, relentless trial and error. The secrets of fast progress is inefficiency, fast and furious, and numerous failures. Now, I'm not suggesting, and I'm really encouraging you to fail. I want you to do intelligent efforts. I want you to try, but it's not fatal if you were to fail at something. The question is, what did you learn from that? What would you do differently? Can you do better next time? So the important thing is to reward excellent failures, punish mediocre successes, according to Phil Daniels. In other words, if someone tries and really makes a really good effort but fails, that person should still be recognized for the good effort. But if people just float along and do something mediocre, that's nothing to be encouraged about. So some bosses prescribe to the growth model, particularly educators who really are trying to train people or educate people. They know that making mistakes is part of the learning process. Like the math teacher is teaching kids how to do arithmetic. Kids are going to make mistakes. So the really qualified teachers, they learn what are the typical mistakes, and they can spot that very quickly, and they know how to correct that. So they realize that most people don't intentionally screw up, but they may sometimes fail. It's simply part of life. So this should be treated as simply an opportunity to learn if a good faith effort was expended in the attempt. But if a boss or supervisor talks the growth model talk, they'd better walk that talk. Because if they don't, trust is lost and probably never to be regained. And the disappointment, whether by an employee or a spouse or a friend, disappointment is poison, which can forever destroy the relationship between a boss and employee. Trust, which may take a long time to build, may be lost in an instant. So if you talk the growth model, walk that talk. Really support your employees on that. So another little saying, someone said, disappointment is a slow poison. The sudden disappointment of a hope leaves a scar which the ultimate fulfillment of that hope will never entirely remove. Disappointment is not good. Bottom line is, when you're dealing with employees and in developing a business plan, we'll have to think about who those employees will be and how they will be managed. We'll have to think about the idea that you can hire people's bodies and time, but people volunteer their hearts and their minds. This is as true in a business as it is in a volunteer organization. So when disappointed when the boss does not walk their talk, employees' motivation drops. There's an old saying that people quit their bosses, not their jobs, but then stay on the job. Oh, bad news. Or if they are an individual with skills in high demand, they leave. So motivating employees is extremely important. Now you need to motivate someone, you need to satisfy some needs, because the person's needs are the ultimate motivators. Now Maslow really came up with the idea of a hierarchy of needs, and that's the primary model of human needs that's we've talked about. And each need can drive behavior, but the theory is that once satisfied, a need is no longer a motivator. So we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We start at the very bottom with physiological needs. Those are the most basic, and until they're satisfied, it's hard to want to have any of these others. You need food, water, warmth, rest. So food, clothing, and shelter really are there. But once you satisfy those, you need to be safe. I mean, you're willing to take a risk to go get food or whatever you need. You need the basic need, but then once you've got it, then you start thinking about, oh, maybe I'll be a little more safe about all this. Once you satisfy those needs, then you really start looking at connectiveness. How do you belong to something? You satisfy your love needs. What intimate relationships do you have? What friends? And then you go to a higher level need of self-esteem, a prestige or feeling of accomplishment. You want to feel like you're accomplishing something. You're doing good. And then at the very peak of this hierarchy is self-actualization. The idea that you're achieving your full potential. You're doing creative things. So really, when you get looking at this, these first two are considered basic needs. The next two are considered psychological needs, but then these are self-fulfillment needs. Whole idea that until a need is satisfied, you're going to be focused on that. And then once you can do that, then you can go up the hierarchy of needs. So obviously, the whole hope is that we would have employees working at self-actualization. They're really gung-ho. They're really fulfilling their full potential. They're highly motivated. That's the goal. Not often realized, but that's the goal. So now, different people in an organization will be at different levels in the hierarchy. So what may motivate one person may not motivate another. So we have to treat each individually differently. This requires flexibility on the manager, leader, coach to find what will work best for each employee, and really at different times for an individual employee. So now, in theory, motivation theory, there's really a couple different kinds of motivation looked at, intrinsic and extrinsic, with the idea that intrinsic motivation comes from within, extrinsic motivation comes from outside. Intrinsic motivation, things like autonomy, mastery, purpose, you're driven because of your own internal desires. On the other hand, extrinsic motivation comes from outside. It comes from what you get compensated at your job, or the negative. If you do something wrong, punishment. I hope I'm going to force this person to do better, or rewards for good performance. These are external motivations. Extrinsic motivators have been proven to be very short-term motivators, but they tend to fade quickly over time. Longer-lasting motivators often are the intrinsic motivators, when people are self-motivated. So we need to provide feedback that grows the individual's intrinsic motivators. The intrinsic motivation factors are feeling of being good at the job. So we need to let people know that they're doing a good job. Frankly, from coaching hockey from little kids, from 5 or 6 year olds all the way up through high school, I found that one of the things that really motivated my kids the most was to catch them doing something right. Oftentimes you think about catching somebody doing something bad. I like to catch people doing something right, and you reward them with that, and that motivates them, and they want to do it again to satisfy you. Another motivating factor is being able to successfully complete all the assigned tasks, feeling or being proud of the job or position at the facility. And then you've got opportunities for growth and development, and the role of faith. And then another internal motivators are like the enjoyment at work, genuine achievement, and personal growth. So now, one of the companies, the Gallup organization, they've done survey after survey after survey for many, many, many years. And Morris Buckingham then wrote a book called First Break All the Rules. And he says that based on all the surveys that had been done, the employees have really 12 questions that they really most want to have answered at work. And these are the ones that he says. Do I know what is expected of me at work? Do I have materials and equipment I need to do my work right? At work, do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? In the last 7 days, have I received recognition or praise for good work? Does my super or someone at work seem to care about me as a person? Is there someone at work who encourages my development? At work, do my opinions count? Does the mission and purpose of my company make me feel like my work is important? Are my coworkers committed to doing quality work? Do I have a best friend at work? In the last 6 months, have I talked with someone about my progress? At work, have I had opportunities to learn and grow? So the question is, in most companies, are the employees being able to ask these questions and be able to say yes? One of my really strong beliefs is number 2 here. Does an employee have the time, tools, and training to do the job right? If they don't have the time, tools, or training to do the job right, it's not the employee's problem. It's a system problem. It's the manager's problem. The manager needs to satisfy that. But a lot of these questions can be answered yes without any expenditure of expense by the company. So these are really important questions, things to be thinking about. So as I'm sure you've noticed, none of these questions are extrinsic motivators. All are intrinsic motivators. And for the manager, leader, coach, the good news is most of these really cost nothing. So another thing that I have really believe in is total quality management. The total quality management movement in the 1950s and onwards was led by W. Edwards Deming, who's known as the father of quality. He was actually an American who went to Japan and taught them how to produce better products. And then after Japan started beating the pants off some of the American manufacturers became interested in what he was doing. So, but one of the things that W. Edwards Deming says was that 90% of problems are system problems, not people problems. We like to, oftentimes we like to find who's to blame someone for the problem, when that may not even be the employee's problem, it may really be the system. But as managers, it's our responsibility to fix that system. People work within the system that's provided to them, and the results are not what we want. We need to examine the system rather than blaming the employee. Conclusions. As I said, employees need the time, tools, and training to do the job right. If we don't provide these things, we can't blame the employee. If an employee is simply overworked and can't get things done on time or with the quality needed, as a manager, you need to evaluate whether additional help is needed or whether some work needs to be shifted to someone else. In an evaluation session, if not before, or preferably before, you ask, what tools or training would be helpful for you to improve your performance? As a manager, we are part of the system. In evaluations, it's important to ask as well, what do I need to do or not do, which would help you perform your job responsibilities better? At Valadco, it soon became apparent we had a system problem. That's all for today. Thank you, and we'll catch you next time.